Today I want to talk to you about making a resizable panel with Framer Motion. So typically Framer Motion is easiest, at least for me, when you're kind of animating absolutely positioned elements or things that don't interrupt the flow. But I've had trouble in the past resizing elements that will reflow the rest of the document. And I always wanted to come up with a technique that would kind of work anywhere and compose well with the rest of my React app. So I think I've landed on a pretty good solution. It might be a little considered experimental, but I want to show you how I built it and then see what you can do with it, see if you can break it, or if it's a pretty good solution. So let's take a look at this demo that I have right here. We just have this panel and we're just using some React state to kind of toggle this expanded Boolean and show more or show less. And so we basically want to get this panel to animate the height as the new content comes in. And so your first guess might be to turn this into a motion div, which we can import from Framer Motion. And then ideally you'd be able to do something like animate height to auto. And this would be awesome if this worked, basically animate the height from auto to auto as it changes. But this is not really possible in Framer Motion. So then you might think, well, let's say initial is equal to height 0. And let's just get something going here. And we're still not going to see anything because this div isn't changing at all. It's still in the DOM. So we need to give this a key so it changes so Framer Motion has something to animate. So maybe we set the key equal to expanded, and that'll re-render this div every time expanded changes. And so now when we toggle this, we kind of see something happening. Usually I like to actually wrap my content in my motion div and move my padding to the inner div. This just acts a little bit more predictably. So we can kind of see something a little bit better here. Let's go ahead and add overflow hidden. And I'm going to come up to the top of my app, wrap this in a motion config, which we can import from Framer Motion. And we'll just set the global transition here equal to a duration of 1, kind of while we debug this. So again, we see that this is working, but it's definitely not doing what we want because we have to go to 0 each time. So instead what we're going to want to do is actually explicitly measure the height. And we're going to do that by coming up here and grabbing one of my favorite hooks, useMeasure. This gives us a ref and a bounds, which we can grab height from. And now if we go ahead and stick ref right here, get rid of initial 0, and we'll just animate the height to the height of that ref. If we give this a shot, we're actually re-rendering this each time because of the key. So if we remove that, we'll look at that. Now we've got some animation. So this motion div is in the DOM the entire time. Framer Motion is just going to trigger an animation every time this variable changes. And that is being updated by this hook to whatever the size of this is. So I like this approach in general because it's kind of transparent. It doesn't care what's rendered inside. So let's go ahead and turn this into a reusable component. So I'll grab this motion div, and down at the bottom, we'll make a resizable panel. We're going to want to come up and grab our useMeasure code. We've got the ref right here. We've got the height right here. And then instead of passing all this stuff in, we're just going to render children, which we'll expose as a prop. So now we should be able to replace all of this with resizable panel, just like that. And then if we come up, we can get rid of this, save. And now if we refresh, we've got the same behavior. So this is pretty neat. Our caller doesn't really have to know anything about how this works. They can just pass in dynamic content here and the panel adjusts. Okay, now we've got the height animating, but let's go ahead and work on actually animating the content so that this is a little bit nicer. We'll come down to our resizable panel. This is the div that kind of renders the children. So let's wrap this with another motion.div. And to start, let's say initial is opacity 0 and animate is opacity 1. So we see this kind of works on the initial render here. But if I toggle this, it doesn't work. And we're back to the problem of not having a key on this. This is just going to stay in the DOM, and these animations are never going to trigger after the initial render. So we need some sort of key right here that's going to change. Well, we could come to our caller and just kind of give our panel an ID. And we know expanded is changing here. So if we expose an ID and use this as our key, well, now we see our animations do trigger when we toggle this. But this is kind of a bummer because, now the caller has to pass in extra data here. It'd be nice if they didn't have to pass anything in. So what else could we use as a key? Well, we are already measuring the DOM element here. And so we know the height is changing when these change. So we could pass in the height for the key. And now we see the animations are triggering, but it's a little funny. This is because of the way useMeasure works. It has to measure this in an effect after render. So that's not the best solution. And also, if we were to change this to something sweet, something that actually had the same height, well, now we don't get our animations anymore, and that's probably not what we want. So height is changing sometimes, but it's not really a natural key here. Now, you might think, well, why don't we just use some sort of variable here and, just trigger this on re-renders, right? So we could just I++ this every render, and this will make sure that this div is basically re-rendered every time this component is rendered. It's kind of going to be unmounted and a new version is going to be remounted. So if we toggle this, this seems to work. But the problem is if we came up here, let's add another button that's going to toggle some new foo state. So it's foo and set foo. Start that off as false. And this will just trigger a re-render of our entire tree. We'll just set foo to the opposite of foo. But it's not actually going to change the content of our panel. And we'll see here, if we re-render this, if foo is true, we'll say y, otherwise we'll say n. Our component's being re-rendered, but the content of the panel is not changing. So we actually don't want to key this just by render. That's not really the right match for what we're trying to achieve. Now, what are we trying to achieve? Well, we really want, this to animate whenever this contents change, right? So it shouldn't animate now, but it should animate now. Well, the contents is actually a prop that we already have. It's children. So really what we want to do, if we could key this element by children. And so if children change, then we want to trigger the animation. And if children don't change for whatever reason and our app is re-rendered, we don't want to trigger that animation. So children is kind of a natural key here. But you can't just throw children as a key like this because these children are recreated each render regardless. And so there's no constant children across renders. And so we never trigger the animation at all. But what if we actually JSON.stringify this and try to kind of do an object compare to see if these have actually changed? Well, if we do that, we're going to get this error. It says converting circular structure to JSON. And this is because children is like this really complex data structure that references pieces of itself. So it's circular. And it also references kind of internal React classes that change, data that changes. And so it's not just a simple data structure of our actual contents. However, there is a sneaky little function that I found on the internet. And it's from an issue where people were basically trying to use Memo and make pure components by comparing children and seeing if they had changed. There's a lot of times better, usually most of the times better ways to do what they were trying to do in this particular case. And so it wasn't necessarily the most encouraged thing. But again, this is kind of where the experimental part comes in. I thought it'd be fun to see if we could actually do this. So JSON.stringify, if we look at the signature here, actually takes a second optional argument called a replacer. And the replacer is a function that transforms the results. So basically, to actually serialize our children so that we can compare it ourselves, this ignore circular references function will first of all return early if a particular key in our JavaScript structure starts with an underscore, which is React internals. And then it will create this weak set object called scene, and it'll add each value that we see as we traverse and try to stringify this nested object of children. And then if it gets back around to it, this is the circular part, if it already has it in that weak set, it'll return early. So we can actually use this as the second argument to stringify. We're going to call this function. It's going to create that set and return a function that stringify is going to use. So if we save this, this is basically a string version of our children. Now if I toggle, look, we get our animation triggered, but if I re-render, we don't. So again, kind of an experimental way to do it. Not sure you want to do this in like thousands of places across your app, but I've always wanted to try to solve this resizable panel problem, and so far it's working pretty great. So this is pretty cool. We've got our resizable panel, and we can even re-render while the animation's happening, but that key is stable, and so everything's working out so far. Okay, right now we have initial and animate on our children here. But it'd be nice to get some exit animations. You know, if we were to bump this up to, say, 2 seconds, we can see that the exiting child goes away immediately. So let's come here and add an exit animation of opacity 0. So the unmounting element kind of fades out. And if we toggle this, we're still not going to see that fade. And that's because we need to wrap this inside of an animate presence. And if you've never used animate presence before, this is what gives us the ability to animate elements out. So now if we hit toggle, well, we will see the unmounting element is animating, but we're having some layout issues here. And this is because when Framer Motion animates these elements out, they're still in the DOM. And so they're both being rendered at the same time. And so we don't want that. We kind of want them to be on top of each other. Now, animate presence does have a cool prop called exit before enter. And if we hit toggle, we'll see that that is one way to solve this problem. Let's pop this down to like 0.5. And so, you know, this might be the effect you want. It's pretty neat. But it's a little bit limiting, and it doesn't give us as much flexibility when it comes to these animations as possible. So let's see if we can do a little bit better. And I think all we need to really do is use absolute positioning here on these elements. So if we make this wrapper around the children absolute, and then we make our parent here relative, look at that. Not only do we have the elements on top of each other with this nice little crossfade animation, the panel starts adjusting immediately, unlike it did, it took some time with the exit before enter. So I like this solution better, and we'll see it gives us even more kind of power and flexibility when it comes to how we want to animate these children. So yeah, this is starting to look pretty good. You know, I think if you had 0.5 here, this is definitely something you could see, you've seen in other websites. This works pretty well. If we refresh, we see we actually have the animation triggering on initial render. So let's take care of that next. And let's start with this height right here. So the panel kind of opens up. Now this is because height is going to be 0 the first frame that we render. Because again, useMeasure uses an effect to actually measure this once it's been painted to the DOM. And because our children are absolutely positioned, you know, they don't take up any space. And so we kind of do this opening behavior here. So let's turn this into an expression here. And we'll say if we've measured the height, then we can go ahead and set it to absolute. It's going to be safe because the height will be accurate. Otherwise, we'll start this off as relative so that it actually takes up space here in the DOM. And so now if we refresh this, this looks pretty good. we don't see the height of the panel animating at all. So that looks great. And now let's see, to get rid of the initial animation on this div, I think all we need to do is add initial equals false to our animate presence. And that's pretty neat. We can give this kind of a hard refresh. Everything is being calculated, so this is going to be, robust to server-side rendering and all that good stuff. But then once this loads, we measure the height, we switch this to absolute, and we see our animations here. So pretty neat. Everything's looking great. Okay, let's test this out a little bit more. Let's push it and see if we've broken anything. Instead of expanded here, let's make this just count and set count, and we'll start this off as 0, and then we'll just increment count by 1, and then we'll do something like if count mod 3 is equal to 0, then we'll render a third paragraph. Otherwise, if count mod 3 is equal to 1, then we'll render our second, and otherwise we'll render our first. So now we should have kind of 3 different states, and that's pretty neat. Looks good. Let's pop this down to 2.5. Refresh still works. Now, actually, when I refresh this, you'll see the measurement here. It looks like the height is adjusting a little bit. So we can tweak this. Instead of animating height right here to the measured amount, let's also just make this the height only if it's measured, but if it's not, we'll just stick this to auto. Again, kind of giving it a solid initial frame here where this is relative and the height is auto. So I think that solved that. Toggle, toggle, toggle. Let's do these in opposite direction here. Maybe 2, 1, 0. So we start off with short, then we go a bit longer, and then even longer. So that's pretty neat. Re-renders still work. Looking good. And now is the fun part. We get to basically just play around with these animations. So right now we have this kind of crossfade behavior where they kind of fade in on top of each other. But if we wanted the first one to fade out and then the second one to fade in, well, we can do that just by tweaking these values here. So let's come up to our global duration. I'm going to say let duration equals 0.5, and we'll just put that in a variable so we can use it down here. And right here, we want the element that is exiting to take half as long as the total duration. And so exit will get its own transition where the duration is equal to duration over 2. And the entrance animation should get its own transition where the duration is also duration over 2. But we actually want to wait until that exit one finishes. So we'll give this a delay of duration over 2. And with any luck, now we have this kind of fade instead of the crossfade. And this is really nice. We can come up here and change this if we want like a really dramatic fade. You're doing some sort of wizard or you're selecting a product and going on to the next step. This is a pretty nice little technique here. And again, everything works, even if we have re-renders. I think that's pretty cool. Now, we could even get a little crazy with this. And what if we were to make these kind of fly out left and right? So initially, if we just kind of for the sake of the demo, say this is 382 pixels. So when we start off, we're going to say X is 382. When we animate in, X is 0. And when we animate out, X is going to be negative 382. Let's see what that looks like. That's pretty neat. I love that this panel is handling all of this. And, I really did want something that kind of composes with whatever you throw at it. And this is pretty awesome. So we see we're kind of waiting until the first one's cleared. What if we were to get rid of these custom transitions so we don't have that delay? And now we have this kind of carousel thing. We can get rid of opacity. And refresh. Now we have kind of a real carousel. We can make this a little bit faster. And you start to see how you can do a lot with this. You know, the first thing that actually gave me the idea for this was if you go to Airbnb and you check out this kind of date picker right here, you'll see we have these two calendars, and you click over and look at that. The panel kind of shifts if you go from a month that has, 6 weeks to 5. And I just love the idea of having something like this reusable, resizable panel that can compose with, more advanced UI elements just like that. So this is basically what I wanted to show you. I know that this is a little kind of, if you saw this in a PR, you might kind of give it a side glance here. But conceptually, I think it does make sense. We want to key this whether the children change, and if so, we want to trigger this animation. And I have in this repo here a route at /demo with controls where I have all these kind of animations we just went through. And you can change them, the crossfade where it kind of goes slowly between them, or the fade where it first fades to black and then goes like that, or you have the slide. So you can play around with this. I'm going to link this in the description below. But hopefully that helped out. If you've ever tried to make like an accordion or a collapsible panel with framer motion, it can be a little tricky in the case where you want to go basically from height auto to auto. But feel free to grab this panel component, see if it works in your project, and I'd love to hear how it goes. Now, if you haven't heard yet, I am working on a course for framer motion, and so I'll also put a link to that course down below. You can sign up and hear more about that. But otherwise, hope you enjoyed that video, learned a thing or two. Again, would love to hear how it goes in the comments below. Otherwise, that's all for today, and I'll see you in the next one.